By way of introduction, let me just apologize in advance for being the only nut on this otherwise distinguished panel. The rest is in your brochure. So let's get started. You know, reflecting on tonight's theme, the art of conversation, my mind immediately turned to those dinner conversations that have stayed with me over the years. You know the ones I'm talking about, the ones that were dynamic and illuminating and fundamentally a testament to character. And two things struck me about those conversations. One, they invariably involved an argument over something, and two, someone left really pissed off. Now, Oscar Wilde, that most celebrated conversationalist, he provided an explanation for this phenomenon. Some, he said, cause happiness wherever they go, others, whenever they go. I see you know some members of my family. And so it occurs to me that we can't have a conversation this evening about conversations without looking at the role of argument in public discourse. After all, there are only a few things more tedious and more destructive to conversation than a room full of people who agree with one another. And the only thing that is more tedious than that is actually a cash bar. Now, for my part, I have always been reflexively suspicious of ideological consensus. There is no such thing as a thinking horde, and believe me, I have narrowly outrun more than my share of them in various war zones over the years. I am, however, not a contrarian by nature. My perspective is that if you enjoy disagreeing simply for the sake of disagreeing, then that doesn't make you smart. It makes you an asshole. Still, I do believe in the dialectic traditions and the value of testing and stressing arguments and exposing assumptions in the process. And yet, the opportunities for us to engage in reasoned and informed debates appear to be disappearing. In the midst of an information revolution, it is this parade of misinformation, the unfiltered, propagandistic, sometimes cruel, anti-intellectual invective that threatens both the substance and quality of our conversations. And there is no greater proof, I believe, of this trend towards critical illiteracy than the media economy that has sprouted up around those who are in no way inconvenienced by things like truth or accuracy or actual knowledge. I'll give you some examples. Sun Television, Fox News, Talk Radio, The Tea Party, Glenn Beck, Ann Coulter, Bill O'Reilly, Donald Trump, Ezra Levant, and Sarah Palin, and that's just to name a few. So let's take a look for a moment at some of the more outrageous arguments put forward by such sources in recent years. Ethical oil, that most obvious of deductive fallacies. To revisit that logic again for a moment, it goes like this. Saudi Arabian oil is bad. Canadian oil doesn't come from Saudi Arabia. Ergo, it sounds more official in Latin, Canadian oil is good. Or gun control, which is a perennial favorite as well, that the NRA continues to advocate for and wins, as we saw in the USA earlier this year, despite the terrible tragedy of Newtown. That they continue to advocate for increasing the flow and availability of arms as a means of protecting against deaths from gun violence, despite the irrefutable evidence from the UK, Canada, and many Scandinavian countries overwhelmingly linking gun control to a reduction in gun-related homicides, including mass killings, but that the NRA can advocate for such preposterous positions, buttressed with bags of cash, and get away with it, should lead reasonable people everywhere to conclude that we are simply not being heard above the fray. And then there are the bread and butter roll arguments that have ruined many a Thanksgiving in the Nutt House. You're a quick crowd tonight. But I'm sure some of you know what I mean here. It is like the annual migration of disputation. There are the festive arguments that take place, and here I have changed all names and familial affiliations. Around the dining room table, the moment that pervy cousin Frank starts expounding on Playboy bunnies as proto-feminists, because After all, he says, without a trace of irony, it is we men who are being exploited in this process. Or when oxy-addled Great Aunt Myrna launches into yet another xenophobic tirade about immigrants stealing all the best corner store jobs. Throw in a side helping of Reaganomics, some income gap inequality, a side dish of drone policy, a drizzle of private versus public sector healthcare, and you're ready for that big mushroom cloud debate on nuclear arms as prevention against, guess what? Nuclear war. And throughout this conversation, it will be pronounced nuclear, not nuclear. And no, there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. And sure, life would be easier if we could ignore the bigots and the chauvinists and the propagandists and the ideologues, if we could just nod and smile and cloak ourselves in Buddhist aphorisms, and if we could stop inviting them to assault us with their freelance statistics and anecdotal evidence, if we could just wake up every day and simply let it go. But some of us weren't born that way, or we weren't raised that way, and so we may as well come prepared. And to that end, I have a few simple tricks that I'm hoping to leave you with here this evening, so that wherever and whenever you find yourselves confronting those preposterous arguments and wondering whether it's you or them, you can rest assured it is probably them. The first one is pretty simple. If someone puts forward an objection to your argument that begins with, you know, they say that, refuse to respond until that person tells you precisely who said what. And if you want to be polite about it, you could say, could you please tell me the source of that remarkable piece of information, because I would like to read it for myself. Or you can do what I do, which is just to keep on hysterically shouting, who is they? Who is they? What does that even mean, they? For the love of God, make it stop. Of course, I recommend only approaching the latter if you are wearing running shoes and have already passed on the dessert. Number 2, avoid psychopaths at all costs. This is probably obvious, but especially if you haven't moved residences in the past 5 years. Along the same lines, arguing with anyone in political office is ill-advised unless you have a valid passport, a viable exit strategy, and up-to-date tax filings. Number 3, humor trumps sanctimony, which tends to be how the left loses, and even reason, which tends to be how the right loses. Number 4, do you remember that Chrétien truism surrounding WMDs in the Iraq War? Da proof is da proof. And when you see da proof, you know it's da proof. Not all evidence is created equal, and some of the most egregious offenders of this principle, I'm afraid, are journalists. When faced with an avalanche of dubious percentages, some useful retorts include, where was that study published? What was the control or comparison group? And my go-to favorite, which is one I found people really appreciate in the midst of a heated argument, is this one, you know, just because something is correlated with something else, like dental braces and puberty, doesn't mean that one caused the other. Also, and I'll call this 4.5, under no circumstances is Wikipedia considered the proof. And finally, always remember the following: teenagers never respect the rules. In closing, the most critical conversations, by necessity, they involve argument. There is, of course, a cost to putting your opinions forward and exposing your certitudes to dissection, to holding up a mirror to society and discovering that it is often the subject and not light's refraction that distorts. As Norman Mailer, himself no stranger to controversy, wrote in his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Armies of the Night, there is no greater impotence in all the world like knowing you are right and the wave of the world is wrong, and yet the wave crashes upon you. Over the years, there have been many times when I have been shot at for what I represent, and those were not metaphorical bullets. At times, I have been dismissed and even publicly maligned for my particular views around humanitarianism, accused of being soft and naive and other inglorious epithets. But the only way that I know how not to drown in the face of those waves is to simply keep on swimming. And I hope you will too. And I wish you the greatest success. Thank you.